Hello, I'm Dr. Katherine Horton. Dear Andrew Parker, this is now my second public appeal to you. I ask you to stop the microwave attacks against me. I ask you to stop the remote interference with my brain, with my limbs, with my muscles, my eyesight, and all my other cognitive functions. I have tried to follow the steps one has to take normally to return something that's out of control back to the rule of law. I tried to report the crimes against me to the police. I have been ridiculed. I've been brushed aside. I have made this public. Especially I have made public how the British police has treated me. But I've also tried to approach, first of all, the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, and that was in quite a panic because, as you know, by that time the attacks against me were rather severe. I have also tried to approach the High Court. I have received a death threat, as you know, on my way to the first hearing at the High Court. And as you know, returning from the High Court, I was demonstratively stalked by your agents all the way back to my hotel room in Richmond. And there I was shot in the head several dozens times until I collapsed on the floor from pain. And this was with microwave weapons. For those who don't know, being shot in the head with a microwave gun feels like having staples shot into one's skull with an industrial stapler. This is how best I can describe it. The pain is excruciating, it's terrifying, and it was unnecessary. It was a gesture more than anything. It was a gesture towards what's going to come in terms of criminality and psychopathology. By that time I could have guessed. Nevertheless, I was assaulted, as you know, in my home in Switzerland, trying to prepare for the court case. I had to flee my home for 2 weeks. I was assaulted at my parents' house in Germany. And in the end, after I asked Judge Edis for time extension, the attacks against me were stepped up. By now, I've experienced all sorts. I know now from experience what microwave weapons can do. I guess this is just a small glimpse of what they can do. Your agents and your cooperating partners have shown me that microwave weapons can be used to damage organs, to cause horrific pain, to give someone brain damage, and brain damage is something that I sustained for sure. I actually sustained brain damage when I was begging the German ambassador in Bern to help me stop the physical attacks against me here in Switzerland as a German citizen. After his own security officer confirmed to me that I'm being attacked by microwave weapons and agreed with me about the culprits, the ambassador refused. However, every single time when I sought help, there were horrific psychopathic attacks against me or a member of my family. And that time, this was just before Christmas, as I was begging the embassy to actually assist me, at night I was so brutally microwaved on the head that I have since then pins and needles permanently in my left hand. And this has now lasted for several weeks, and I guess that's the indication of brain damage. And this was brain damage to the right hand side of my brain hemisphere, so the right hemisphere, and that's precisely the brain hemisphere that was attacked in Manchester as I was just taking part in the court case of Dr. Stephen Frost versus MOD as an observer. And I have made contact with Dr. Stephen Frost because he's another whistleblower, and I thought that I can actually talk to him and seek help because he would understand my situation. And he did, and Dr. Frost actually offered me a lot of support and gave me tips of what to do and how to cope with this incredibly terrifying situation that he himself also knows, having gone through what I personally consider also to be an MI5 takedown operation. That's my personal opinion, which I would like to air here because I think it is relevant, because I am not the only person who is suffering at the hand of your agents. By now I recognize in other victims what has been done to me. Most notably, I also recognize what has been done to Philip Kerr according to his own testimony, and I recognize what was said in Philip Kerr versus MI5 at the Investigatory Powers Tribunal. The abuses against Philip Kerr are almost identical to what I've experienced. He was also kidnapped. I do not remember having been kidnapped, but he was drugged, and I also think that I have been infected with something and possibly also been drugged in one form or another. What I want to say, Mr. Parker, is that the situation we find ourselves in now is that the victims of your agents are and have been public for a very long time. They are begging for the crimes against them to be stopped publicly on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on lots of other social media sites. They describe in greatest detail assaults that sound very much like assaults with microwave weapons. And as you very well know, and it's now public, microwave weapons and electromagnetic weapons in general are hailed as the weapons of the 21st century by not just American but also Russian generals. And what this situation looks like at first glance is human experimentation. Your agents are callously experimenting on the civilian population, and as much has already been admitted, confessed to by an ex-agent whistleblower, Karl Clark, in the German press in 2009. Now this was 8 years ago now. The crimes haven't stopped for 8 years. They have just affected more and more victims. By now the situation is intolerable. The actual overt physical assaults against me, at first they were covert. I think the actual physical assaults started a long time ago, but the overt assaults started in July 2015. But since January 2016, they have been non-stop. I am being shot at, and I have got huge amounts of radiation, damaging radiation, being punched into my body every couple of minutes, if not every couple of seconds, in my own private home. Your agents have also tracked me. When I went abroad, I was physically assaulted in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Italy, and Spain. And I now ask you to cease and desist again for the second time publicly. As I said last time in my last public appeal, taking MI5 to court in the High Court, seeking an emergency injunction, I think also counts as a request for cease and desist. I have now spoken about the assaults against me to 3 judges. I have desperately sought an emergency injunction against your agency. And the acts of your agents have prevented me from preparing the evidence because I have been assaulted non-stop with military microwave technology as I was trying to prepare the court case. It was also during that time that I received my first death threat and survived an assassination attempt on the Swiss motorway, 3 days after receiving my death threat on the way to the High Court in London. What has happened to me in London shows me that British intelligence is not just involved, it also displays a callousness, an arrogance, and out-of-control criminality that is a threat to every nation on the planet, but first and foremost also to the British people. From Twitter, from YouTube and Facebook, from the desperate pleas of UK citizens, I gather that what is being done to me is not unique to me. You also do it to your own citizens. And therefore, Mr. Parker, I ask you, not just for my sake, but also for the sake of all UK citizens, that the physical assaults, the human experimentation be stopped against them. And as I said before, it's only at first glance that it looks like human experimentation. Because from what I gather, looking more closely at the data and speaking to human rights charities about these problems, what also transpires is that the vast majority of the victims are actually female. My personal impression is also that the overbearing majority of the victims are actually from the minorities, the ethnic minorities in the UK. And I don't have to tell you what that means, Mr. Parker. I think everybody who watches this video understands what it means, but I would like to spell that out yet once more. for scientific experiment, for human experimentation, one would expect equal numbers of male and female victims, even for a rogue, covert human experimentation program. And that's because any scientific experiment would want to have data on both sexes equally. If the majority of the victims are female, it doesn't look like human experimentation anymore. It looks like sexual violence or war crime. And last time I said that, as far as I can tell from the evidence I have seen and from what I have experienced, your agents are committing war crimes against the UK population, and your agents are committing war crimes against me and my family. And I ask you to stop. I ask you to help me to return this out of control situation back to a saner world, to a saner situation whereby even your agency upholds the rule of law and human rights in particular. And I would like to say and emphasize that as far as I'm aware, still, in the eyes of the law, human rights are inalienable. Every human being has got the right to life, a right to private family life, and the right to health and to live in peace. Even from government agencies that traditionally had supreme power. And Mr. Parker, I ask you yet once more to stop the attacks against me. After I made my pleas public, I was brutally assaulted last night again. Your agents did what they do every single night, which is shoot into my head non-stop. I had difficulties going to bed. I was trying this weekend, after the terrors of the past year and after the incredible strain that the psychopathic assaults by your agents have put on my husband and me, we were trying to have just a peaceful, calm weekend as a couple, trying to heal all the damage that has been done through the psychopathology that we never even knew as possible from your agents. Nevertheless, your agents continued to shoot into my body at every opportunity. Very quickly, early on in the assaults here in my flat in Switzerland, I learned to avoid the windows. And this is something that's common to a lot of the victims. And that's because glass transmits microwave radiation almost 100%. And I have to say, near the windows, the attacks from the emitters that are placed at my neighbors are unbearable. However, at night, the power is ramped up, and I can tell for sure that even the walls are punched through with the beams that are being aimed at my head. And I know that for sure because I can tell the directionality by just putting a hand on my aching head and then feeling the intense beam in my hand as the knuckles and the joints start aching as I reach into the beam. I have now networked with a lot of other victims, and from what I gather is that this radiation is, amongst others, used to grow synthetic fibers in our bodies, in the bodies of our victims. And I think this is used to eventually build little receivers inside our bodies that can be used for remote interference. And I don't have to point this out to you, but I do nevertheless. This is a crime against humanity. It is a breach of the Geneva Conventions. It's an act of war. It's an act of war crime to use civilians for experiments that actually originated in the death camps in Germany in the Second World War. And now I ask you again to stop the attacks against me. The transmitters that are shooting into my body, as far as I can tell, come from houses within a 200-meter radius of my home. Your agents have tracked me non-stop and made that clear through street theatre since November 2011. I had break-ins into my home in Oxford and also here in Switzerland, and from that it's pretty clear that you know where I live, and from the harassment that seamlessly mirrored that I experienced in the UK, I also know for sure that you know where the houses are that are being infested by these agents and the trainee agents and you also know where the transmitters are, and I ask you to switch them off. And I ask you again to take charge of this case personally and have the attacks against me stopped. I will continue making these requests until you stop. But I would like to emphasize that rather than stopping the attacks when I asked publicly, they ramped up. I was shot into non-stop last night. I was woken again in the middle of the night. I was tortured and maimed and debilitated. Microwave guns are essentially cancer weapons to first order. And then they cause tissue damage, brain damage, organ damage. And I also would like to point out that what's being done to me is the power, as far as I can tell, the power in the microwave beams is cranked up to such a high level it doesn't just punch through the walls and deposits huge amounts of microwave energy in my skull. The energy seems to be so high that it actually cooks bits of my brain. The water in the cell seems to be superheated, and I can hear popping sounds when the attacks start inside my skull. Having worked on high-frequency ultrasonics, I recognize these popping sounds as cavitation. And I think, from what I know from physics and as a researcher, I would conclude that the microwave energy that's deposited in my brain is so high, the tissue is being cooked in small areas, the water in the cell superheats, and as the bubbles collapse, there's a shockwave that pops the cells and tears through the tissue in my brain. And then when this shockwave hits my skull, I can actually hear the sound in my ears. And through this, I can actually hear the mutilation in my skull. I can actually tell how my brain is being shot to pieces by the microwave guns that your agents aim at my head. And I ask you to stop. You have now damaged my brain so extensively that I've got non-stop pins and needles in my hand. And this was a retaliation attack that I received because I dared to go to the German ambassador and beg him for help. Every single time I reached out for help, there were brutal psychopathic retaliation attacks by your agents and their cooperating agencies. And I ask you to stop these attacks. You have mutilated me so hard. I've got pins and needles in my hand. My handwriting is deteriorating. And I also feel that I've been damaged inside my body because I keep having more and more physical complaints that I didn't have. Within a year, your agents have debilitated me, Andrew Parker. And I ask you to stop. I'm now making this appeal public. And I know that your agents are running what's called the empire that never sleeps, so I expect that you get this message. I also want to make it public that the brain damage that I receive seems to be interfacing somehow with remote radiation, because your agents seem to be able to set off my wounds and make them tingle, like they can make my hand tingle now. And I can continue working, trying to figure out what these injuries are, and I can try to track them down, but I also ask you to stop. Thank you for listening.